I don't talk about Henry Letham much anymore. The men who were there don't ask me to, and the men who weren't there don't really want to know. There's a version of the story that Command put in the after action, 6 paragraphs of clean operational language with all the weight pressed out of it, and I suppose that version serves its purpose. It moves Henry from the category of anomaly into the category of asset, which is what Command needs to do with things it cannot fully explain. But I was the one who sat with him over 3 days in that converted lecture hall. I was the one who carried him off the bridge. I was the one who watched his face at the end, and I owe it to whatever's left of my professional conscience to say what actually happened, even if I still don't fully understand all of it myself. I need to go back to the morning they brought him in. We were operating out of what used to be a university medical center on the north end of the Green Line. The Green Line was the last coherent defensive perimeter on the eastern seaboard, a ragged arc of fortified positions stretching 42 kilometers from the old rail yards down to the river. Some of the positions were hardened in the conventional military sense: poured concrete, layered electronics, overlapping fields of fire. Others were rubble piled against building facades and held by soldiers who had been rotated in and out until the rotation system broke down, and then held by the same soldiers who'd been there to begin with. Inside the Green Line, there were roughly 400,000 people. Outside it, there were the Lethari, and everything the Lethari had processed in the course of their advance, which included most of the eastern seaboard from the coast to the mountains. The name Lethari wasn't ours. A journalist coined it in the early weeks, a rough phonetic approximation of the sound the creatures made when they communicated at range, a low, cycling vibration that our audio equipment could barely resolve into discrete signal, like trying to record thunder through a paper wall. The name stuck the way all bad names stick in a crisis. You stop caring what you call the thing that's killing you. You just need a word short enough to fit in a radio transmission, short enough to say quickly when you don't have time for the Latin. I was a forward psychiatrist attached to the 7th Stabilization Group. That title sounds more important than it was. What I actually did was sit in a converted lecture hall, whiteboards still up. Someone had left a semester's worth of organic chemistry problems half erased across them, and I had never gotten around to having them cleaned off, and I talked to soldiers who had broken in various ways. Some had broken quietly, some loudly. Most were in the gray middle ground where a man could still perform his duties if you gave him somewhere to put the things he had seen. We were 4 psychiatrists for 11,000 military personnel, and whatever civilian intake came through the gates. We had stopped maintaining any pretense of adequate resourcing around the 4th month. I had a cot behind my office, and I used it in 2-hour intervals when the work allowed, which was not often. The morning Henry came in, I was covering for Bate Levy. Bate was the senior psychiatrist on our rotation, 12 years my senior, field medicine on 3 continents before the incursion, a woman of formidable patience and 0 tolerance for self-deception, in herself or anyone else. She'd been the first to formally document what we were seeing in the Lethari contact survivors. The way encounters with the creatures seemed to erode a man's sense of his own edges, the borders between what he'd witnessed and what he'd imagined, between his own thoughts and thoughts that felt borrowed from somewhere else. She called it boundary dissolution in her first report, offered a list of plausible neurological explanations, and recommended further study. Her second report dropped the plausible neurological explanations and replaced them with a section she titled Anomalous Findings with Careful Precision, and a kind of professional courage that I have always admired. Her third report made a claim about the Lethari that Command did not want in their filing system. She'd written 3 detailed documents. Command had acknowledged them with a form letter each time. 3 weeks after the third report, Bate had a breakdown in the middle of a session, sat down in the chair across from her patient, and began crying in the controlled, almost apologetic way that people cry when they've finally depleted the last reserve they were running on. She had to be sedated. She was moved to a rest facility outside the medical sector. She asked me, the morning before she was transferred to look after her caseload. I was given Henry Letham as a specific priority. He'd been recovered 2 days earlier from the outer perimeter, half a kilometer past the wire, sitting in the rubble of what had been a pedestrian overpass. He wasn't armed. He wasn't in uniform. He was 20 years old. He gave his name as Henry Letham when the intake corporal asked, and he claimed to have been living outside the Green Line for approximately 11 weeks. That alone should have been impossible. The Lethari cleared everything outside the perimeter within the first 48 hours of each advance. Whatever they encountered, human or animal, living or recently dead, they processed. The word we used was processed because we didn't have a better one, and because the alternative, which was absorbed, carried implications about the nature of the Lethari that command preferred not to formalize in official language. In 11 weeks outside the wire, Henry Letham should have been processed. He was not. He was dirty and significantly underfed, and there was old scar tissue on the left side of his face from a wound that had healed without treatment. But he was alive and coherent, and sitting quietly in my intake room like a man who had been given an appointment that he intended to keep. I introduced myself. He looked at me with dark, careful eyes, the eyes of someone who has been paying very close attention to everything for a long period of time, and he said he'd been expecting someone older. I told him his previous doctor had been reassigned. He nodded, as though he'd anticipated that too. I ran the standard evaluation. He was oriented to time and place. He answered factual questions accurately, including questions designed to surface confabulation. He knew what month it was, what had happened in the weeks before the incursion, what the approximate population of the Green Line was based on information that would have been current when he left. He did not exhibit the gross dissociative symptoms we typically saw in Lethari contact survivors, the looping speech, the identity blurring, the episodes of apparent dual consciousness, where a person would speak simultaneously in 2 registers, one familiar and one that was not theirs. He was calm, almost preternaturally calm, in the way of a man who has moved through extreme fear and out the other side into some wider territory where fear has become background rather than foreground. When I asked him why he'd gone outside the wire, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance past my left shoulder. Then he said they needed someone to talk to. I asked him who he meant. He looked at me with something I can only describe as patience. The patience of a person who expects not to be believed and has made his peace with it. The patience that is not resignation but its own kind of discipline. The Lethari, he said. They needed someone to talk to and I was there, so I talked to them. I wrote down what he said and kept my face professionally neutral. He watched my pen move and said, "You think I'm psychotic?" I said I didn't form conclusions in the first session. He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, it was the beginning of one, interrupted by whatever he was about to say next. He said, "Saturday, 3 days from now. They're going to push the Green Line. Everything you have on the eastern sector won't hold. They told me where they're going to hit and how. I can tell you if you'll listen to me. But I need you to understand something first, and you won't want to hear it." I asked him what I wouldn't want to hear. He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "I don't think I'm going to be alive to see Sunday." I held my face still. I asked him if he was considering harming himself. He said, "No, it's not that. I don't intend it. I've been near them long enough to feel the edges of things. And there's something on that bridge Saturday night. Something that's going to happen. I know I'm part of it. I don't know which side of it I'll be on when it's done." I sent his file to Intel that afternoon. Standard procedure for contact survivors with potential intelligence value. What Intel did with it in those first hours was what Intel always did. They sat on it, because the information came from a source they couldn't verify through conventional means, delivered in language that sounded at minimum like severe trauma response, and at maximum like active psychosis. And the people trained to evaluate such things were stretched across a 40-kilometer defensive arc, and could not readily spare attention for one young man who claimed to have had extended conversations with the enemy. I meanwhile went back to see him. This is the part of the account I have always had the most difficulty explaining cleanly to anyone who wasn't there. I have examined it from every professional angle I can bring to bear. I have turned it around in my memory like a stone you keep finding in your pocket, examining it in different light, looking for the rational explanation that would make the subsequent events comprehensible as the product of ordinary human decisions. The simple truth is that something about Henry Letham pulled at me in a way I could not account for clinically, and I have been a clinician long enough to know the difference between genuine intuition and the pattern-matching errors of a brain running 30 hours without sleep. What I felt in that intake room was not fatigue. It was not transference. It was something closer to recognition. He reminded me, in some way I could not precisely identify at the time, of myself. That is an uncomfortable thing for a psychiatrist to say about a patient. I am aware of how it sounds, but there it was. I went back on the second day and I sat with him for 4 hours. The organic chemistry problems were still on the whiteboards. He looked at them while he talked. Occasionally, the way people look at neutral backgrounds when they're trying to find the right words. He talked about the Lethari with a specificity that was either the product of genuine extended contact or the most internally consistent delusional system I had encountered in 20 years of clinical practice. He described the way they communicated, not language, not quite, but something older and more direct, a transfer of organized impression that bypassed the sequential structure of speech entirely. He said that in the presence of one of them, you didn't hear thoughts, you received shapes, emotional architecture, the three-dimensional form of an experience rather than a description of it. He said it was like standing at the edge of a very large crowd and suddenly being able to hear every individual conversation at once, and simultaneously understanding that all those voices had always been one voice, and that you had always been part of it whether you had known it or not. He said, the terrifying part is not the contact. The terrifying part is coming back, getting to the other side of it and returning to the clean boundaries of your own skull and realizing how quiet it is in here, how specific, how alone. He looked at the whiteboards again. He said, I spent a long time thinking that was a weakness, being individual, being limited to this one head, this one history, but it's not a weakness. It's a specific kind of richness. The Lethari have everything that ever happened to all of them and they can't grieve any of it. Because grief is what happens when the border between you and someone else holds and that person crosses to the other side of it. They've never had borders. Nothing has ever been lost to them. That sounds like an advantage, and it is the saddest thing I have ever encountered. He told me about their biology in terms that matched nothing in our existing contact reports and everything in Bate Levy's unpublished third document, which Henry had never seen and which I had not mentioned to him. The Lethari did not experience individual death the way we did. When a single organism died, its organized consciousness, whatever they used instead of memory, the record of experience that would dissolve in us but did not dissolve in them, folded into the larger collective, the way a tributary folds into a river at the end of its run. They had been doing this for what Henry estimated, based on what they had shared with him, to be something in the range of 40,000 years. The oldest of them contained the organized experience of thousands of individual lives, layered like sediment, each stratum still present and accessible. They were not, in any meaningful sense, mortal. Individual organisms died. Nothing was lost. I asked him what they wanted. He said they wanted what any consciousness wants, to be known, to have the shape of their experience witnessed by something outside themselves. He paused on that and seemed to weigh it, and then he said, except that they don't have an outside themselves. Not really. Every time they encounter a new consciousness, it eventually gets folded in. Everything they've ever touched has become part of them. We're the first thing they've encountered that has stayed outside. That has refused the folding, even when the alternative is death. I asked him why we refused. Biologically, He clearly had a theory. He said, because we're built around the border. The individual self isn't a limitation we could shed if we tried hard enough, it's structural. It's the operating premise of every neurological system we have. The Lethari keep trying to absorb us and we keep dying instead, and they cannot understand why, and it's driving them toward behaviors that look like aggression, but are actually, in their frame, something closer to frustrated curiosity. I said, they're killing hundreds of thousands of people. He said, I know, I told them. They don't, and here he stopped and found the right word with care, they don't experience regret the way we do. What they do with biological material they encounter, the processing, the absorption, they don't understand why we experience it as loss. They understand it intellectually now because of our conversations, but they can't feel it. They've never had a border between self and other that could be violated. They don't have the architecture for grief, any more than a man who has never seen color has the architecture for blue. I asked him what he thought we should do about that. He said he thought we should show them. I went home that night, home being the cot behind my office, and I lay there and I thought about Henry Letham for a long time. My partner Leela came by around midnight. She was a medic out of the 11th, a woman with steady hands and steadier judgment, and she had a habit of checking on me when she came off a long rotation that I had stopped pretending to be uncomfortable with. She came in quietly, pulled the other chair to where she could see my face, and sat down with the particular patience of someone who knows better than to speak first. I told her about Henry, not the intelligence material, not the strategic content, just the shape of what he'd said. The things he'd described about the Lethari, about what it was like to be near them, about what he believed they were actually trying to do. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her, the ability to hold silence while someone else filled it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the floor. Then she said, "Do you believe him?" I said I didn't know. She said, "That's not what I asked." I lay there in the dark for a moment and thought about it honestly, the way you can sometimes think more honestly at midnight than at noon, when the machinery of professional skepticism is running a little slower. And I said, "Yes, I think I believe him." She put her hand over mine. She said, "Then you need to be careful." I asked her, careful in what sense? She said, in the sense that if he's right about what's coming Saturday, you have 48 hours to get someone in command to listen to a young man who by any clinical measure sounds like he should be in a locked ward. And if he's right about himself, she paused and didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She knew what he'd said about Sunday. I asked her if she wanted to know what he'd said about the bridge. She looked at me. She said, "Tell me." So I told her about the bridge, the structure on the eastern edge of the Green Line, the partially demolished suspension crossing, its central span still intact over the drop, the 6 months of unexplained equipment failures when the engineers tried to bring the last section down, the personnel who returned from assessment missions with incomplete memories, Henry's belief that the Lethari were maintaining it deliberately, that they were waiting for something to happen there, that they needed a witness. When I finished, she sat with it for a while. Then she said, "What kind of witness?" I said, "A human one. Someone who can understand both sides of what happens and be changed by it." That's what he said. He said they've never had anything witness them that they couldn't fold in afterward. We're the first thing that stays outside them, and apparently that's significant to them, in a way they don't fully have language for. She said, "So they've been fighting us partly because they're curious about us." I said, "That's what I think he was telling me, yes." She was quiet again. Then, "And what happens at the bridge Saturday?" I said, "I don't know. He doesn't know precisely. He said it felt like an invitation." She didn't say anything for a while after that. She got up and made the small cup of instant coffee that I kept on the desk more as a ritual object than a functional beverage, and she stood at the window that looked out over the medical compound, and she drank it. Outside, the Green Line's lights were visible, that chain of hard white illumination that marked the perimeter. Past it, darkness. The Lethari didn't generate visible light ordinarily, or at least we had no reliable records of them doing so. She turned around. She said, "I'm going with you when you go to the bridge." I told her I hadn't decided to go to the bridge. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for statements she was choosing not to contest directly but clearly found implausible. She said, "Go see Leon tomorrow, before you do anything else." Dr. Leon Patterson was the senior psychiatrist on the Green Line's Western sector, a man 20 years my senior who had been practicing medicine in conflict zones since before I'd graduated. He'd been blinded in an engagement 18 months before the Lethari incursion. A fragment had taken his left eye and damaged the optic nerve serving the right during a forward operating accident that had nothing to do with the Lethari and everything to do with an ammunition storage protocol that someone had failed to follow. He worked with a medical assistant and a cane, and made it very clear that he did not want accommodation, operationally or conversationally, and that he considered pity to be a form of disrespect that he would not tolerate from people he respected. Leon had been Bate Levy's mentor, had recruited her to field medicine, had overseen her first deployment, had maintained the kind of deep professional friendship that survives the kinds of things that field medicine does to people. When Bate broke down, Leon had quietly collected her files and begun reviewing her case notes in the days after she was transferred. He was the one who had flagged Henry Letham for me specifically, rather than assigning him to the general intake rotation. I went to him the next morning, as Leela had said. His office was in the western section of the medical complex, a room that smelled of old coffee and antiseptic, and the particular dust that accumulates in rooms where paper has been stored for a long time. He was behind his desk when I came in, cane across his knees, turning it slowly in his hands in the way he did when he was thinking. He had the patient files in a folder in front of him, Bates' handwriting on the tabs. I closed the door. He said, "Sit down, Sam. Tell me where you are." I told him. Everything I'd told Leela and more, the details of the second session, the things Henry had said about the Lethari's biology, about the bridge, about not seeing Sunday. I talked for a long time. Leon listened the way he always listened, very still, his face attentive in a way that didn't require sight to communicate. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he said, "What does the boy need?" I said I was still assessing. He shook his head slowly. He said, "Sam, what does he need? Not clinically. What does a 20-year-old who's been alone outside the wire for 11 weeks, who may or may not have 48 hours left, actually need from you?" I held the question. It was not a clinical question, and he was right not to dress it as one. I said, "He needs to be believed. He needs someone to believe that what he experienced was real and that what he's trying to do matters." Leon said, "And do you believe it?" I told him what I'd told Leela the night before. Leon nodded once slowly. He said, "I read Bates' third report, not the summary she filed, the complete document, the version she kept in a personal folder that she trusted me with before she was transferred. She documented 9 contact survivors. In each case, the details they provided about Lethari biology and behavior were consistent with each other in ways that exceeded any plausible shared delusion. In each case, the survivors made predictions about Lethari activity that were subsequently verified. In 6 of the 9 cases, the survivors died within 72 hours of their first interview, from causes that were physically ambiguous. In the 3 cases where they survived, something interceded. Someone stayed with them. I asked him what he meant by interceded. He said presence, human presence, sustained, deliberate, genuine engagement. In all 3 surviving cases, there was a medical professional who did not manage the patient from a clinical distance but sat with them, talked to them, believed them. Bate documented it. She thought it mattered. She thought it might be the variable. He turned the cane in his hands. He said she was right, I think. The Lethari process everything they encounter. They process biological material. They process information. The reason they can't process us completely is that we're built around individual identity in a way that resists folding. But that resistance isn't infinite. In the contact survivors, extended proximity starts to erode it. What keeps a person intact? What maintains the boundary Bait thought it was anchoring? Having another human being there, who knows who you are and insists on it. I said, Henry doesn't have that. He's been out there alone for 11 weeks. Leon said, which means whatever is anchoring him is internal, which is remarkable, Sam. That is a remarkably resilient human being, and you are possibly the only person in this compound who is currently treating him like one rather than like a source of tactical intelligence. He put the cane down on his desk. He said, go to that bridge, take your medic, bring him back. I am trying to be accurate here, and accuracy requires me to say that I went back to Intel before I went to the bridge. I gave them everything I had from Henry's sessions, the coordinates, the methodology, the timing. I sat across from a captain named Reyes who was good at her job and clearly running on insufficient sleep, and laid it out as clearly as I could, including my professional assessment that the source was credible, and that the intelligence was consistent with Bait Levy's documented contact survivor reports. She listened carefully. She asked 3 sharp questions. She said she would escalate it to Vasquez, and that they would run it through whatever analysis framework they currently had, which she did not elaborate on. I went back to Henry that afternoon. He was drawing when I came in, at the small table they'd given him, bent over a collection of intake forms he was using for paper because we didn't have anything better. He drew the way a person draws when it's the only way they know how to think, not for an audience and not as a record, but to move the inside of the mind into the visible world where you can examine it. He didn't look up when I came in, but he said, I wondered when you'd be back. I sat down. I asked him how he was sleeping. He said, better than outside. Worse than normal. I dream about them. It's not unpleasant exactly. It's like, he paused, looking at whatever he was drawing, it's like having a radio left on in the next room. You can hear the shape of it without making out the words. I looked at what he was drawing. He pushed the finished sheet toward me. It was the bridge. Rendered in ballpoint pen, detailed and accurate in the structural way that suggested he had studied it carefully rather than imagined it. The suspension cables rendered as individual lines, the broken approach spans shown at their correct angles relative to the main deck. And in the margins, in the spaces between the cables and along the edges of the deck, he had drawn shapes. The shapes were not human. They were not anything from our sensor imagery, the blurry thermal outlines we'd been working from for months. They were detailed and specific and internal in the way that drawings are when a person is rendering something from memory rather than observation. The small, confident decisions that distinguish recollection from invention. I recognized them from one specific page in Bait Levy's 3rd report. A page where she had included, with visible professional reluctance, what she called suggestive visual data from a contact survivor who had been an illustrator before the incursion, who had drawn in the margins of his intake, forms the same way Henry drew in the margins of his. I said, tell me what happens on the bridge. He put down his pen. He looked at me directly. He said, I've been trying to figure out how to explain this for days. Whatever they know about Saturday, the attack, the eastern sector, all of it, that's secondary. That's not what this is about. What this is about is that they want to show us something. They've been trying to show us something for months, and they keep killing us instead, because they can't figure out how to do it without folding us in. And the folding kills us, and they don't understand why, and the cycle keeps going. He said, what I told them in 11 weeks of conversation, I told them about death, about what it is to have a border that can be crossed permanently, about grief, about what it feels like to lose someone who was on your side of the border and is now on the other side and you can't follow. I don't think they had ever had that explained to them before, not by something outside themselves. They've been carrying human consciousness for months in the collective, and it's chaos in there, because none of it is organized the way their own consciousness is organized, and they can't make sense of it. I helped them make sense of some of it. I said, and Saturday. He said, Saturday is them giving something back. I think they want to return something, not the people. I don't mean the people, but the organized impression of what those people were, what they felt, who they were specifically, the individual shape of them. I think they've figured out that the only way to give it to us without killing us in the process is to give it to one person at a time, one person who understands enough of what they are to receive it without the boundary dissolving. He looked at the drawing. He said, that person is me, because I'm the only one who's talked to them long enough. I said, and you think it will kill you? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think it might. I think it might be like receiving a very large amount of very organized grief all at once, and I'm not entirely sure the human nervous system is built to hold that much of someone else's loss. But I think I'm the only one who can try. And I think, he stopped and started over, I think they need to know that we can hold it, that we have the capacity to receive our own dead, that there is a container in us large enough for that. If I can hold it, if I can take what they're trying to give back and survive it, I think it tells them something they need to know about us, something that changes what this is. I said, what does it change it into? He said, from a war about whether we can be folded into something else, a negotiation maybe, between two kinds of consciousness that have finally established that the other one is real. I told him I would be at the bridge. I don't know what made me say it, or rather I do know, and the reason is that he was right. And I knew he was right, and the clinical distance that my training wanted me to maintain had become a kind of cowardice that I wasn't willing to practice anymore. He needed a witness, a human one, someone to stand at the edge of what was going to happen and insist by their presence that he was still himself. I could do that. It was the thing I was trained to do in the deepest sense of training, not the clinical protocols but the fundamental premise of them, which is that a human being in extremity needs another human being present, not managing the situation from a remove, present. He said, don't come alone. I said I'd bring Leela. He nodded, as though he'd already accounted for her. That evening I tried command one more time. I asked Vasquez for an emergency meeting. She gave me 20 minutes, which was more than I'd expected. I laid out everything, Henry's intelligence on the eastern sector, the coordinates, the methodology, the timing. I laid out Bate Levy's case documentation, the 9 contact survivors, the 3 who lived and why Bate thought they lived. I told her what I thought was going to happen Saturday night, and what I thought it meant for the broader situation on the Green Line. She listened. She was a careful officer and a perceptive person, and she listened with more openness than I had expected, given the subject matter. She said she would have the eastern sector reserves on heightened readiness. She said she could not, based on what I'd given her, order a redeployment. The tactical calculus did not support it from the information she had. She said she would have people watching the bridge approach. She asked me, as I was leaving, whether I believed what Henry had told me. I told her what I'd told Leon and Leela. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, if you're right, this is the most important thing that happens in this war. If you're wrong, you're a good psychiatrist who got too close to a contact case. Either way, doctor, do what you have to do. I went and found Leela. She was in the medical bay finishing a long shift. She had blood on her sleeve from a shrapnel case that had come in 2 hours before, and she was drinking water from a canteen, and she looked, as she often looked after a long day, like someone who had decided some time ago to find the work worth doing, and has held that decision against considerable evidence to the contrary. I told her what I'd told Vasquez. I told her what Henry had said about the bridge. She put the canteen down. She said, you know, this might be exactly what it looks like. A young man who's been through extreme trauma and has built a coherent belief system around an experience that may have been largely internal. I said, I know. She said, "And you're going to the bridge anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "Then I'm going with you. I want to be very clear that this is not because I believe everything he said. It is because you are going and I am not letting you go alone, and because, regardless of what happens on that bridge, if he goes into cardiac arrest on a suspension structure in the middle of the night, someone needs to be there who knows what to do about it." She pulled out a fresh set of gear. We slept in shifts. By 200 Saturday we were at the perimeter checkpoint on the eastern approach. I showed credentials, and we were passed through with less resistance than I had expected, which told me Vasquez had made some quiet arrangements that she hadn't mentioned and which I was grateful for. The Lethari were quiet along the eastern perimeter. Too quiet. The soldiers at the checkpoint had the particular stillness of men waiting for something they can't yet name. The bridge was as Henry had described. The approach spans were gone, collapsed months ago in a controlled demolition that had successfully removed the crossing capacity, without touching the central suspension span, which had resisted every subsequent attempt at demolition, with a consistency that the engineers had filed under materials anomalies and left alone. Getting to the central span required a ladder that some previous unauthorized visitor had left on the pylon. The rungs were cold under my hands, and there was rust at the joints, and the whole structure swayed slightly in the pre-dawn air. Leela went first, I followed. Henry was already there. He was standing at the center of the span, at the highest point above the drop, facing east. He was wearing the clothes we'd issued him, clean now, but wrong on him the way new clothes are wrong on someone who has been wearing the same things for months, the clothes of someone else's expectations rather than his own. The sheaf of drawings was folded into his front pocket. He heard us approach and turned. He looked at Leela for a long moment, measuring, not unfriendly, the way he looked at everything he encountered for the first time. Then he said, "Good, I'm glad she came." I asked him if he was all right. He said, "Yes, I've been here before at night. They come here. This is where they come to think, I think, or whatever they do instead of thinking, when there's no processing to be done and they're just being. Some of them are old enough that they remember the bridge before it was a bridge. They remember this crossing as a ford in a river. That's how old some of them are." I looked east. Nothing visible. The darkness over the ruined eastern city was complete and total. We waited. I have spent considerable time in the years since trying to account accurately for what the waiting felt like. It was not fear, exactly. It was larger than fear, the way that standing on a high ledge on a clear day is larger than the ordinary fear of heights, something that uses the same neurological registers, but at a magnitude that outgrows the usual frames. I was aware of Leela beside me. I was aware of Henry at the center of the span. I was aware of the city behind us. 400,000 people sleeping or standing watch or tending to the wounded, all of them alive on this side of the wire, all of them possibly dependent on what happened in the next hour in ways they would never know. The Lethari came at 4:11. Not the way they came in the contact reports, not the organized biological formations that our perimeter sensors tracked, the ground-level advance that used the same routes and the same timing, and had the mechanical quality of something following a plan. They came as light. That is the only word I have that doesn't distort it too badly. A deep, patterned luminescence rising from the eastern darkness, not the hard light of weapon systems, or the cold blue-white of surveillance equipment, but something organic, the kind of light that living things make when they are numerous and moving in concert, bioluminescent and structured, organized into something with the quality of intent. Leela made a small sound beside me. Not fear, something more like the sound a person makes when they see something they were not prepared for but are glad to have seen. The light came closer. I could see in it the shapes Henry had drawn. Not in detail, not in the way you see a thing in daylight, in the way you see something in low light that your mind assembles from suggestion and prior knowledge. They were present, and they were vast in the way of things that are not primarily biological, that have been accumulating for longer than any individual body has been alive. The oldest of them felt ancient in a way I can only register in retrospect, the way you sometimes understand the age of a stone formation only after you've left it. Henry stepped forward to the leading edge of the span. I moved to follow, and Leela's hand was on my arm before I'd consciously registered moving. She said very quietly, "Wait, let him." I held still. Henry spread his arms. Not in surrender, the posture was nothing like surrender. It was the posture of a man who has carried something a very long distance and has finally arrived at the place where the carrying ends and the delivery begins. He stood at the edge of the drop with his arms out and the light before him and the city behind him. He spoke. I have tried many times to reconstruct what he said, and I cannot do it with accuracy. This is not a failure of memory in the ordinary sense. I believe the experience itself produced something in the listener that affected retrieval, a quality of the Lethari's proximity that Bate Levy had documented in her contact survivor reports as a kind of resonant interference with ordinary recall. What I retained was the shape and the register of it. The cadence of a man explaining something important to an intelligence that has never heard this explanation, that is receiving it for the first time, in a form neither purely human nor purely anything else, translated into whatever medium exists at the boundary between a mind that knows individual loss and a consciousness that does not. He told them what dying felt like. He told them with the precision of a person who has lost people and survived the losing. His parents, I knew from the sessions they were gone, both of them in the early incursion. He had been outside the wire when it happened and had processed the knowledge of it alone, in the rubble, with the Lethari 300 meters away, and had kept going anyway, and had found a way to make that grief into something other than destruction. He told them about the border, about what it felt like to be a single distinct consciousness, to have a self with edges that could be crossed permanently in one direction, about what it was to love something on your side of the border and then stand at the border and know that it had crossed, that you would not cross after it, that the distance created between you and the thing you loved was absolute and permanent and could not be folded together. He told them about what humans do with that, how we build structures to hold it, the specific human architecture of grief, the rituals, the language, the way we gather and tell stories about the dead, the fact that we insist on keeping the dead present in our consciousness even when they cannot be present in the physical world. How that insistence is not a failure to accept loss, but a refusal to accept that love stops being real when the object of it stops being alive. He told them that their processing, their absorption of the humans they had encountered, the consumption of biological material and organized consciousness, was not received the way they intended, that we were not being incorporated into something larger and continuous, that we were ending, that the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable thing that each person was simply gone. He cried somewhere in the middle of it, not dramatically. He cried the way people cry when they're telling the truth about something hard, quietly, without stopping, the tears secondary to the words. The light changed. I am trying to be precise, and I am not confident I have the vocabulary for precision. What had been a broad advancing luminescence organized itself into something more structured, more focused, the dispersed attention of a vast collective consciousness drawing together toward a single point, toward Henry. The weight of what was organizing itself toward him was the most extraordinary thing I have ever been in proximity to, and I do not expect to be in proximity to anything like it again. And then I felt something that I have no clinical category for, and have struggled for 8 months to describe accurately. It was grief. Organized, vast, and human in its shape if not its scale. The grief of every person the Lethari had processed in 18 months of incursion. Not diffuse, not the ambient pressure of the collective, organized, individual specific. Each person's grief shaped by their individual life, preserved in the Lethari collective with perfect fidelity, and now being offered back. The shapes of who those people were. the interior architecture of what they had loved and feared and hoped for and regretted. The specific weight of each particular life. Henry was receiving it. I could see it happening. He shook with it, not from cold, not from physical distress, but in the way a structure shakes when it is bearing more than its design anticipated and is deciding whether to hold. His face was something I have no word for, the expression of a person doing the hardest possible version of what they are built to do, at the absolute outer limit of what a human nervous system can be asked to contain. He turned his head once and looked at me, just once, and what was on his face in that moment under everything else was, "I'm still here." I said his name, just that. He turned back to the light. He collapsed at 4:19. No dramatic moment, his knees folded, and he sat down on the bridge deck with the boneless deliberateness of someone whose body has made a decision that the conscious mind didn't quite get ahead of. I was moving before he hit the surface. Leela was moving before I was. His pulse was faint and arrhythmic. His breathing was shallow but present. There was no wound, no obvious physiological cause for the collapse, which was consistent with what Bate Levy had documented in the 3 surviving cases. The body reaching some kind of system boundary after sustained proximity to a consciousness that did not experience individuality as a natural condition. Leela's hands were already doing what her hands were trained to do, and she was talking to him continuously in a low voice, the way she always talked to patients who might or might not be able to hear her. She had made a decision early in her career that she would behave as though they could hear her, and she had kept that decision against everything the war had done to make it seem irrational. I held his hand. I said, "Henry, I'm here, you're on the bridge, you're still on the bridge." "It sounds like nothing," said plainly. But in the context of what Bate had written about the surviving cases, it was exactly the right thing. The anchor. Another human being insisting on the specific reality of who he was and where he was, and that he had not been dissolved into something else. His pulse steadied, slowly. Across several minutes that I was not counting in any normal way, the arrhythmia smoothed into something with a recognizable rhythm. We carried him off the bridge between us. Leela took his left side and I took his right, and we moved toward the ladder and down it, and across the approach rubble, and through the checkpoint where the soldiers watched us with the expression of men who had decided not to ask questions that they were not certain they wanted answered. Behind us the light was still there, but different, pulling back. Not withdrawing in the way of an advance that has been checked, pulling back in the way of a thing that has delivered what it came to deliver, and is returning to its own country. The eastern sector attack never came. At dawn there was Lethari movement along the perimeter, real movement, not the sensor ghosts we'd been chasing for weeks, but it was pulling back, not advancing. Vasquez called me at 700 and asked me what I knew. I gave her the coordinates of the bridge and told her to review the overnight sensor logs for the eastern approach. I did not give a complete operational account. I filed a report that was accurate in outline and incomplete in detail, which I am not proud of as a professional practice, but which I judged necessary, because a complete account would have been processed by command into a series of tactical analyses and protocol updates and intelligence assessments that would have missed the point of it entirely. The point of it was not tactical. The point of it was that a 20-year-old man had stood on a bridge in the middle of the night and held the grief of thousands of dead people in his nervous system, because someone had to, and had held it without breaking, and that in doing so he had demonstrated something to a 40,000-year-old collective consciousness about what humans actually are. Henry Letham was in medical for 9 days. I saw him every day. He was not dramatically changed in the ways that the catastrophic cases were changed. He was not fractured, not looping, not exhibiting the dual-register speech. He was tired in a bone-deep way that was different from exhaustion. He slept 12 to 14 hours a day, and when he woke he was quiet and careful, choosing his words with more attention than before. He was eating everything they put in front of him, which Leon said was a good sign. He talked about the people, the ones whose grief he had received. He did not have their memories, he was clear about this. It was not emerging, not what he had tried to describe in sessions as the folding. He had the impression of them, the organized shape of who they had been. He said it felt like standing in a room where many people had lived for a long time, where the space itself had taken on the quality of their presence. He said he felt less alone than he had before the bridge, and also sadder in a way that was not pathological but simply large. I asked him if he regretted it. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, no, they needed somewhere to put it. They had all of that and they didn't understand what to do with it. It was chaos in there, all that human feeling with no framework to hold it. I gave them a framework. I explained the framework. I think that's what the whole 11 weeks was, actually, me explaining the framework. I asked him what he thought would happen now. He said they're going to try to return it, all of it. Not to one person, they understand now why that's too much. They're going to figure out how to give it back in pieces in a way that the recipients can hold. It'll take time. They don't operate on our timeline, but they'll try. I said, is that how the war ends? He looked at the window. He said, I think that's how the war becomes something else. I don't know what it becomes. Something harder to name. Something more like two kinds of consciousness that have finally established that the other one is real and are trying to figure out what that means. He was discharged 9 days after the bridge. He shook my hand at the door of the medical wing. A firm, deliberate handshake, the kind that means something. He said, I didn't think I'd make it to Sunday. I said, you did. He looked out at the sky, the morning sky over the green line, pale and cold and still intact. He said, do you think they'll come back? I said I didn't know. He said they will, but different. Whatever I held for them, they're going to carry it now. They don't have a choice. When something gets folded into the collective, it stays. They're going to carry all of that human grief for as long as they exist, which is a very long time. I think it will change them. I think it already has. He walked down the corridor. I stood at the medical wing door and watched him go, and I thought about what Leon had said 4 days before the bridge, that I still believed in salvage, that it was why he had given me Henry's file. I do believe in salvage. I believed it before Henry and I believe it now, not because salvage is always possible, but because the decision to write something off, a person, a situation, a possibility, is always made too early. The thing that looks like it can't be held together usually can be held together by one more person deciding that the holding matters. It costs something, that decision. It costs something real. I have paid that cost and I would pay it again. Leon retired from the medical service 6 weeks after the bridge. He came to find me before he left, which is what Leon would do. He sat across from me in my office, with the organic chemistry problem still half erased on the whiteboard behind my head, and he turned his cane in his hands and he said, "You did well, Sam." I said I wasn't sure I'd done much, that Henry had done it. He shook his head. He said, "You believed him when it would have been easier not to. You stayed with him. You were on that bridge. Don't minimize what that costs and what it means, because the boy needed a witness and you were it. And without that, the rest of it doesn't happen." He stood up and offered his hand, and I shook it, and he walked out. And I sat in my office for a while afterward and thought about what witnessing actually means. Not observing. Observing keeps a distance. Witnessing is what happens when you allow the distance to close enough that what you see changes you. When you decide that the armor of professional detachment is worth less than the full, unmediated weight of being present for something that matters. The Lethari needed a witness because they had never had one. Everything they had ever encountered had been absorbed or fled, and neither absorption nor flight involves standing still and choosing to be changed by what you see. Henry stood still. I stood still beside him. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Leela and I still talk about the bridge sometimes, in the small hours when the city is quiet, and the perimeter lights are visible from the window, and the diplomatic channels that nobody is publicly calling diplomatic channels are grinding towards something that nobody is publicly calling peace. She says the thing that stays with her is not the light and not the scale of it and not even what Henry said. It's the moment when he turned his head and looked at me. She says, he just needed to know you were still there. I tell her I know. She says that's it. That's the whole of what we do. We stand there and we let people know we're still there. I don't have anything to add to that. She's right. She's right in the way that simple true things are right without qualifications. Outside the window, the city is doing what cities do in the aftermath of things they have survived. It is rebuilding, imperfectly. It is arguing about resources and politics and what comes next. It is grieving, in the dispersed ongoing way that communities grieve, not in the acute way of the bridge, but in the long, slow way of people who have looked at the full account of what they've lost and are deciding how to carry it. The green line is still there, but it has changed character. It is less a wall against an enemy and more a threshold between two kinds of understanding, which is not the same thing and is better. Henry is out there somewhere. He sends messages occasionally through the old intake contact system, short notes without much operational content, the kind of notes a person sends when they want another person to know they are still present and intact, still here, still specific, still himself. That is enough. The coffee before dawn is the same temperature it has always been, and the light through the window is the same light. I am the same man I was in all the external measurements, and in the ones that count, I have been changed by what I was present for, and I have no complaint about that. Being changed by what you witness is not damage. It is the intended result. I don't know how to close this accounting cleanly. I have tried several endings and none of them land right, and I have decided that the reason is that the thing itself doesn't close. Henry Letham stood at the edge of what was genuinely alien and chose to explain himself rather than retreat, and the universe, or whatever portion of it was paying attention that morning on that bridge, took note of it. We are still here. That was the point all along.